So, all right, here's a really quick explanation lecture on the age of exploration, which we've done in class, but this is in case you need a review or you've been missing. So here is what you need to know. One, we're talking about early exploration. One, you have to understand the reasoning for the age of exploration really goes back to the trade that was coming out of the Middle East. The Silk Route and spice routes that were coming from India and from China is what's kind of inspiring this need. And the Crusades had opened up this massive amount of trade as soldiers went from Italian city states and from Germany through Constantinople into the Holy Land. Well, as they came back, they brought with them goods, and the merchants who brought them by boat, in the case of the Italian city states, then go back like semi trucks. When they call it deadheading, is when you go back with an empty load, right? There's nothing in it. You're not getting paid. So Italian merchants would haul back with them silks, spices, things like that. That same spice trade, and when we talk about spice, we're talking like peppers, things like that, peppercorns, like the things you put in your pepper grinder. That's what they're talking about. Hence why when Columbus comes to the New World and finds what we would call a bell pepper or jalapeno peppers, he calls them peppers because they're spicy. They're actually not peppers. The peppercorns are what they're looking for. Because remember, food, there's no refrigeration, and over time food would become gamey, and the spices then would add that to it. And Europeans didn't have the spices like that give food that zest. So they would bring back the products with them, which then that's going to encourage the wealth that we're going to see in the Italian city states, which then will help cause the Renaissance. And then because of these merchants, it's going to create this money exchanges, this banking, which led to families like the Borgias and the Medicis, who are lenders. So you see how it's all interconnected. This really starts with Marco Polo in 1271. And matter of fact, Marco Polo's book about the trade with China and his exploration in China is what inspires Columbus to do what he does. Also, the Chinese themselves are going out and expanding during this time. This is Zheng He, the Chinese, and this is the Ming Dynasty. And why don't the Ming then? Why don't the Chinese? Now, granted, this is not going to be in the AP European history test, and it's not really an AP European thing, but it is a world cultural thing in that Zheng He, during the Ming Dynasty, while he was on his explorations around, and they reached as far as Africa and potentially even reached the New World. While he was on his exploration, the Chinese Ming government or Ming dynasty had collapsed to a degree. There was what they call times of struggle. And because of that, the government was unstable. And the Chinese had always had this idea that they were the center of the universe and the only advanced civilization. So you can see how bringing back information about European societies, Indian societies, African societies, like the Swahili or the Indian Mughal empires, that this would cause a destabilization of the Chinese concepts of the universe. It's very much the 1947 what if, put the tinfoil on your head this moment. 1947 argument about why the government would cover up aliens coming to America is that our entire religion, culture, society is based on that we are the only and most dominant culture, civilization, species in the universe. That would all come screeching to a halt overnight. And in a collapsed government like what the Ming were becoming, that was not the moment to do it. So Zheng He's fleet was destroyed, and most records of his discoveries were destroyed as well. It wasn't until modern history, really recent history, that this was discovered. And this is one of the Ming ships. What are the motivation to go? Well, the easiest thing is, like we said in class, to compare this to was very much like the 1950s, 1960s space exploration. The Crusades had basically inspired it economically. The potential for wealth and technology that comes out of space exploration creates this as a need to go. Also, this idea of the monarchs in this time period see this as a chance for revenue, yes, but it's also a source of competition that we can beat the Russians in the 1950s, 1960s, whereas in the 1400s, 1500s, it was the Portuguese who were desperate, by the way, economically. The Portuguese don't have any major trade, and they also don't have major economic power. There's no sustainable crop thing. There's no minerals that the Portuguese, and faced with Spain that is unifying behind in its back, they had to find some way to create wealth, and exploration through crusades and for competition is a way that the Portuguese, Henry the Navigator, was able to do this. You also have this insurgence of ideas. The Renaissance fuses people with this idea of adventure, this idea of self-worth, this idea that you can do it. And it opens up all these new scientific discoveries, which led to new technologies. Also, the trade routes with the Chinese and Muslim had introduced the ideas of gunpowder, better sails, astrolabes, aquabuses, all these things that were needed for technological advancement, much like World War II had given the United States and the Soviet Union rocket technology, computer technology, radar, pressure suits, all these things that were needed to go to space, that new ideas. The Reformation, again, that's the competition thing, that we have to go and recruit. There are two ways, we talked about this in class, to make a good Catholic or to make a good Lutheran. All right. One is the old fashioned way. You get a mommy Lutheran, a daddy Lutheran, or a mommy Catholic and a daddy Catholic, and they make baby Catholics. The other way is to, and the Catholic Church had not had to do this for centuries because it was the only game in town. Now, all of a sudden, because of the Lutherans, the Catholics have to go out and recruit. And so that's the reason for exploration to a degree, is to bring these Hispanic populations later, what we're going to call Hispanic, but native populations, into the Catholic Church. And vice versa, that for them to make baby Lutherans, they need new land. And so that's what you're going to see with the English, and to a degree, maybe with the French, but they're Catholic, so it's a whole different thing. We already talked about the competition thing, the technology, we already talked about that. And the other thing is the fame and fortune, is that people remember who the first man on the moon is. By the way, it's Neil Armstrong. People remember who the first American to orbit the Earth, John Glenn, or the first American in space is Alan Shepard. Okay, we remember who the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin. That's kind of what this is. Columbus, Diaz, da Gama, Magellan. All right. That was a chance. And some of these people, especially the conquistadors, in the case of Pizarro and Cortez, these are men of low birth. They don't have fathers. They're illegitimate. They have no way to fame and fortune during this time period. And so going out and being a conquistador and taking over these lands is a way of increasing their wealth and power and being social status that they didn't get before. So it's very much the same thing like you see in the 1950s and 1960s. And these are the things we talk about. Astrolabe allows you to find the North Star, which then helps you find your latitude based on the angle to the North Star. They had better maps and cartography, which allowed them to follow the coasts. You had a sextant, which allowed you to navigate even more accurately than an astrolabe. And then, of course, the compass, which allowed you to find due north, which then allowed you to stay on a steady course. They had better ships. The Carvel, which is basically the size of a Winnebago camper home, but it was a better hull and had better sails, which made better speed, especially with having the moon sails, right? These top sails, and then pirates would call these like the moon sails, is that they would catch even the lightest breeze, which keep the ship moving. The wheel lock, which replaced the aquabus, and the matchlock, which is, better technology. And granted, native population spears and bows were probably actually better weapons, but the wheel lock obviously creates a concept of terror, that huge roar and bullet that you can't see striking someone, but also it doesn't take much skill to point and fire it, where a bow takes a skill and accuracy to fire. And these things, you just basically point them and then hope to God it works. So Henry the Navigator, sorry, got cut off. This is the Portuguese thing. And that would figure into an SAQ question, is why Henry Navigator is important, is the Portuguese had no real economic opportunity, and exploration allowed that opportunity, which then creates competition. So because Spain could easily like manipulate and control Portugal and was growing now as a bigger state, that threatened the power of Portugal, which then pushed Henry the Navigator to push for space exploration. So, and this is the museum in Lisbon that honors his school of, and he creates a school of navigation. And because of this, you're going to see, and remember, in 1453, the city of Constantinople is going to fall. When the Ottoman Turks shut off that trade through Constantinople, they don't completely shut it down. They're just taxing it. And as we all know, we don't want to pay more for things. Hence why products are shipped and made in other countries at lower paid wages so we can buy things at a cheaper rate. We don't want to pay for them at a higher rate. And since the Ottomans were now charging a higher tax coming through Constantinople, which is the land route, we had to find a new sea route to China and to India to get our spices and to get our silk. Diaz is the one who sails around the Cape of Good Hope. And the reason it's called the Cape of Good Hope at the southern point of Africa is because if you get around it, you got a good hope of making it. This is a place where there's huge storms. And remember the National Geographic episodes where the sharks jump out of the water to hit their seals? That would be the breeding ground of those great white sharks. So you literally have sharks that are about the half the size of your boat in storm swells of 30-foot waves, and you can kind of figure out why they call this the Cape of Good Hope. But Diaz makes it around, which is later going to lead to the Dutch settlement of South Africa and what later becomes the Boers, which are the Dutch who settle there, and then they are going to erase African culture and history and create a thing called apartheid. So, yeah. Da Gama is the one who actually makes it to India, which then opens up India as a trade route. Now, eventually, this is going to lead to French and English and Spanish in India. But eventually, the English are going to be the ones that manipulate and control India and make it part of the British crown. And that's coming later. And actually is tied to the American Revolution, if you would believe it. I mean, and that's, we're going to get Calcutta and then obviously. And eventually the Portuguese are going to spread all throughout the Pacific, and same with the Spanish. The Portuguese are going to have contact with the Japanese, hence why Japan has, well, if you like tempura, like that's a fried food from Japan, that's a product of the Portuguese. Guns are going to come from the Dutch. That's a whole different thing. You're going to see the Spanish are obviously going to have contact in the Philippines, hence why it's called the Philippines. It's named after Philip II of Spain. And so that's why Spanish is a dominant language besides Filipino and English in the Philippines. Just like French is going to be a dominant language in Vietnam, but that's not going to come until we get to the age of imperialism. All right. And so this is Chang Yi's fleet. Again, we talked about, and the Da Gama is going to fall apart of that. Christopher Columbus. Columbus, again, is a person of not well birth, okay? And Columbus sees this opportunity to get rich and famous. And he takes a book by Marco Polo and goes to Ferdinand and Isabella and proposes his plan. And he'd been to multiple courts. This is like the most rejected man in Europe. He has gone to basically everybody and proposed his plan to sail straight. Because he actually thinks the Earth, and the idea that the Earth was round was, for the most part, an accepted concept in most scientific fields. And most people at the time had accepted it to a degree. Now, Columbus thinks that the world actually is smaller, and he doesn't realize there's an entire, like, couple continents in between him and China. So he thinks it's going to take less time, and he thinks he can get there pretty easy. He's completely wrong. This guy's not right about anything, all right? He's not right about anything. He will never admit that he is in a new place, ever. He thinks that one last voyage, he can make it to the new world, make it to the old world, because he thinks he's already there. Hence why he misnames the indigenous populations. He also is going to do, now, why is he important? For Europe, obviously, he's the first one to make it back. Europeans had actually been to the New World. The Vikings had been here, but their crops couldn't survive in this climate, and their cattle died, and they also were susceptible to diseases. And what happened was that in their weakened state, the native populations in the northern parts of Canada wiped out the Vikings. Either disease, starvation, or native attacks wiped out the Vikings. And the reason why that we don't know this is that the records of it, since Vikings passed their stories down by word of mouth, the stories got lost. Eventually, we were able to find records of this and show how Leif Erikson and his people had made it all the way into the New World eventually. But that took a long time to figure that out. And it's a modern concept, right? So Columbus, the first one to go and come back, and he comes back with gold. He comes back with spices. He comes back with natives and opens up this trade route. Now, why did Ferdinand and Isabella give him? Well, again, let's point out it's not Ferdinand. This marriage, this empire by marriage thing, she is the real powerhouse here, right? It's not Ferdinand. And so Isabella realizes that after the Reconquista that they had removed most of the economic base for Spain, that when you tried to forcefully convert the Muslims and the Jews, and those that converted stayed, but many of their populations, in the case of Jews, had gone to Eastern Europe, in the case of, namely Poland, and the Muslims had mostly gone back into Morocco and North Africa, that you had basically dumbed down Spain because that was the most educated people in Spain. And on top of it, they were the ones who were the merchant class. And so she was trying to rebuild her merchant class, and she's willing to take any chance to do it. This is the equivalent of your father going to Vegas, putting all, or your mother, in this case, because it's Isabella, putting all of your college fund on black on the roulette table and say, spin it. Because she's got nothing left to lose. She takes what she has in the national treasure, gives this man the money, enough to buy 3 ships, fully crewed, and think how insane this is. This is Wile E. Coyote kind of stuff. Like trying to explain to NASA scientists, what we're going to do is going to put you in this big cylinder full of this explosive stuff, shoot you in space. You're going to fly around a couple times. You're going to fall back to the earth, and this parachute might open, and it's going to get like the hot as the sun on your capsule as you fall through. And then you're going to fall in the middle of the ocean somewhere, and we're going to try to find you. And the astronauts go, okay, I'm good with that. That's kind of what Columbus's voyage is. Think how desperate you have to do to be famous. Think how desperate you have to be to make an economic decision like Isabella's, to bet your national treasury on something that has about a 75 to 80% chance of failing. And you do it anyways. So, and it paid off. Now, Columbus obviously will go down in history as, in my opinion, a little bit of a moron in the fact that he doesn't realize he's in a new place. But also, the disease concept here with native populations, obviously, he could not prevent. But there are examples where they intentionally left people behind, either because they were too sick or they want to infect their own crews, which then exposed native populations. There's also the fact that Columbus promoted openly the idea of enslaving Taino people, which are the native indigenous populations of the Caribbean, into intentionally using them as labor force to dig gold and silver needed for the Spanish. So yeah, he's kind of creepy sometimes, when you think about it. It's kind of like that. He's a hero in that he goes and does this, but also the impact then on native populations. It's like, what version do you take? So yeah. And then here's his 4 voyages. And most of the people during this age of exploration is like a coin. There's the side that you look at and go, all right, well, if we hadn't done this, you wouldn't have led to America. You wouldn't have led to European dominance. And you would have, and basically the entire history of Western civilization in the modern history. At the same time, look at what happened to the indigenous population. So it's like, you feel, like I said, there's that creepy feeling with you that, do I celebrate the achievements or do I mourn the losses? It's that hard challenge in history sometimes that we have to make each as individuals. So that's my little thing. All right. Magellan, first one to circumnavigate the world, even though Zheng He had probably already done it. This is European history after all. All right. So Magellan, he himself is not going to actually make the journey around the world. He dies because his men provoke natives in the indigenous populations in the South Pacific, and he dies from his injuries. But his crew makes it back. Part of his crew, not all of his crew. And of course, eventually that's going to open up, and that's why Columbus is important, is it opens up the tap, right? And then everybody, and this is the thing, if you looked at the question, like we're talking about the SAQ question about political impact of the Columbian Exchange, here's the political effect. This is the English, right? Here's Cabot, here's Hudson, here's Forbush. The English are going north. Here's Riley. That's going to lead to Virginia later, right? And then eventually we're going to get Jamestown up here, right? You've got the French with Cartier, and then you've got Champlain and LaSalle, which we have a town named after, LaSalle, Peru, or Joliet and Marquette. And they're going to explore all the way down here to the Mississippi River. And then, of course, you've got all these people here. Vespucci, who, by the way, Amerigo Vespucci is the first European to actually, it was a map maker working for Amerigo Vespucci who decides that this is a new place. And so Vespucci is why we call it the Americas. It's named after Amerigo Vespucci. That's why. And by the way, North America is this, South America is that. When we say America, you're actually talking about the whole thing. It's supposed to be the whole thing. But we, obviously, in America. Cortez, all this, that's the competition. It opens up the spigot, right? And then everybody wants to come. And like I said, it's a coin. There's if you don't have Riley, you don't have Virginia. You don't have Virginia, you don't have Jamestown. You won't eventually get Plymouth, and that you're not going to get America. And at the same time, you're going to get eventually slavery because of cotton production and tobacco production, and you're also going to get how you treat the native populations. It's a two-edged coin that we all have to decide how do we write that. So there you go. Okay, so we talked about this, the Aztecs, and there's a whole thing in the reading about this, about the Black Legend. Cortez does benefit from diseases, but and yes, there were native indigenous populations that aided Cortez to defeat the Aztecs. But in the end, he does murder Montezuma, and he does, he causes the murder of Montezuma, and he does subjugate the Mexican population. But he does create Spanish control of Mexico, which then led to the Inca India, which then led to the mixing of Spanish and native cultures, which then led to what we see as Hispanic culture today. Diez de Muertes, the fact that 99.9% of Latin America is Spanish Catholic, or the fact that you have, it's a whole, the Spanish being the dominant language, some form of Spanish being the dominant language in almost every single country except Brazil, which it's Portuguese is there. You see what we're talking about here is that it's that coin thing again. So, and then there's Montezuma. And then, of course, with Pizarro, you have the conquest of the Incas. And then, of course, see why this is important again is Pizarro ends up murdering, even though Atahualpa meets the demands that he has, Pizarro still kills him. And in the end, that caused Philip II then in Spain to panic when Pizarro comes back, that if you can kill a king there, maybe you can kill a king here. So there's this inkling then of commoners having the ability to challenge kings. And it panics Philip, and he has Pizarro in prison. So Pizarro does all this to defeat the Incas and to raise his social status. And in the end, it costs Pizarro his social status because kings are starting to realize wait a minute, these uppity peasants could actually harm me. Now, here's where the thing is, though. Sugar, we're going to talk about. This is the sugar processing, and this is what we call the Columbian Exchange. Now, they're basically for the LAQs, SAQs. Remember, there's no DBQ on this time period. If there's just not. The only way you'd get a DBQ that'd be about this time period if it's actually about imperialism, which I doubt they'd do a DBQ. It's most likely to be an LEQ, right? DBQ would actually be about imperialism, but they'd link this to this. We'll actually do one of those in class just to see what one looks like. So how did the Columbian Exchange? Now, remember, don't mix this up with the triangle trade. Triangle trade's different, okay? It's the slave movement that though links to this, because if you think about it, the potato right here and maize, right? Potato, maize, possibly even the tomato, the tomato in here, those are going to lead to this idea of population growth. So if the question were on the SAQ, how did the Columbian Exchange impact politics during from 1400 to 1600? It affected politics because it engaged in the idea of competition. Okay. Now they may take it all the way up to 1800. Okay. They may say they take it all up to 1800. We haven't gotten that far, but the same premise is there. It's competition. And Henry the Navigator wanting Portugal to become self-sufficient and be able to stand up to Spain. That's competition. The idea in 1588, Queen Elizabeth literally is using pirates, guerrilla warfare, using pirates like Sir Francis Drake and the Sea Dogs to raid Spanish ships. And he's good at it. She's using guerrilla warfare and supplying weapons to the Dutch to feed their civil war because they're Protestant against the Spanish. And then she murders her own cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, to prevent him from marrying her and having a way to the throne. All those things are going to provoke Spain, but those pirate thing, that connects to the Columbian Exchange, the amount of silver and gold that's flowing out of the New World is what's going to feed the Spanish Armada in 1588 when the Spanish tried to take England. You could fast forward. This is what we used to call the French Indian War. In European history, we'll call it the 7 Years' War. It is clearly a colonial war fed by the wealth and power that the Columbian Exchange generated. Okay? If they asked you about culture, population had dropped severely before this time period because of Black Death and the 100 Years' War and everything like we had talked about in the late Middle Ages. This is clearly an example of how that population has increased. The potato, maize, that's corn, because most Europeans ate bread. With the introduction of, and that's not like corn you think of, like the big ear, it's a smaller ears that can be used ground up to make like corn bread. The introduction, particularly the potato, is going to change populations. It's in every dish in Germany. If you're in England, potatoes show up quite a bit. Ireland, it's in everything. All right. That changes the population in that you're going to see an increase in population. Turnips, things like that are exchanging. They're come to the New World. That's going to have the same effect over here eventually in populations. But the potato and maize are going to cause an increased population, which then is going to cause this growth. You're also having a cultural thing, and this is where the triangle trade does link into it. So, but remember, in the LEQ or an SAQ, you have to actually say potato. That the potato is going to cause an increased population, which changes the culture of Europe. They have more population, that causes more stuff, right? Okay, now here's where the triangle trade fits into it. You ready? We're actually going to start in Europe. Is that the trinkets and liquor and guns are being traded to Africa, right? That is then traded for slaves. Now, who's trading that? Well, it's not the kings, right? It's not the nobility. It's the commoners, it's the blacksmith, it's the carpenter, it's the fishmonger, that they all give money to a sea captain who takes these trinkets of liquors and guns and takes them to Africa to buy human beings, which are then shipped, which sugar and coffee actually came from the old world, but are planted over here because the climates and the soil are perfect for them. All you need is the labor force. And so I take a couple £1,000 money, buy these things, trade them here for thousands of dollars worth, right? Hundreds of dollars here, thousands of dollars here. I traded them for. I go over here, I trade the thousands of dollars worth of slaves for millions of dollars worth of sugar and coffee and tobacco, which I then ship back to the new world, or to the old world, and sell for millions of dollars worth of goods. So I started with hundreds, traded that for people for thousands, shipped it to the new world, these people, and traded them for the labor force that's going to create the tobacco, coffee, and sugar, which then comes back over here to the old world. And I then pay off all my people that invested in my ship. And that then creates, not the word yet, we're not there. Middle class does not show up as a word until the 1800s. But what we're creating is a wealthy merchant class. They're not noble, right? They're not kings. They're not lords. They're commoners who are merchant trading class people who are going to become, with the Industrial Revolution, the middle class. Right? We got to get to the Industrial Revolution to get the middle class. But this wealthy merchant class is basically the beginning of a middle class. And why do we know they're middle class? Because poor people buy what they need. Middle class buy what they need and what they want, and wealthy just simply buy what they want because their needs are taken care of for them. Right? Because they pay people to take care of those things. And so tobacco, coffee, sugarcane are all things that you don't need. They're luxury items. And they're tied directly to this wealthy, merchant, growing, soon to be middle class. Remember, you got to use the term merchant class, right? Commoners, merchant class. And when you get to the 1800s, you can kick out that middle class like you guys are. But you see what I mean? Even the way you use tobacco depended on class. Poor people would chew it because it would last the longest. Middle class, look at every painting of a sea captain or wealthy merchant. They've got a pipe. They smoke it, partly because it's easy. It frees your hands up because you keep the pipe in your mouth and you can still work, but also the fact you want people to see you smoking it. You can go to a coffee house. Coffee houses are going to be related to business. And wealthy people, well, they snuff it. They snuff it up their nose, and they have their little jeweled boxes they keep it in and stuff because they don't want to seem unseemly. They don't want people to see them doing it. Okay? So you see how this works? The Columbian Exchange causes the triangle trade, which creates a wealthy merchant class, which is fed off of coffee, tobacco, sugar, which is a luxury good. That changed the culture of Europe. See? Now, economically, you could argue that this is also an economic thing, that the idea that you're creating a wealthy merchant class through the triangle trade, which is tied to the Columbian Exchange to produce things like sugarcane and tobacco. Well, yeah, you're right. That is an economic thing also. So see how this is all connected here? And that population change is going to lead to things like the French Revolution. It's going to lead to things like nationalism. It's going to lead to a thing called the Industrial Revolution. Okay? That tobacco and sugarcane and coffee are obviously going to lead to a little thing called the merchant class, which eventually is going to lead to the Industrial Revolution, which is going to lead to a thing called the middle class, which is going to change all of history. And obviously what's happening with the slave trade is going to cause a major disruption. However, I hate to tell you this, it's not going to show up as much in European history because Europeans are going to dump out slavery in the late 1700s and in the 1800s, but they still haven't solved that little thing called slavery in their own countries called serfdom, especially in Eastern Europe. Okay. And that's also why slavery didn't take off in Europe, is that they already had slaves. It was the population. Serfs were slaves. So in Eastern Europe, where it's mostly agricultural, they don't need slaves. They've already got them. And slavery will die out as unseemly. And by 1830, pretty much all the Western countries have gotten rid of slavery. It's in America, and hence that's why that's tied to American history. So hopefully that made sense. Okay. For the Spanish, this is how it worked. You explore it, the conquistadors go conquer it, you send missionaries to convert the people there, you create a permanent settlement, and then boom, you're an officially European colony. For Western Europeans, you basically taken out these two. The explorers are the conquistadors, if that makes sense. I mean, when John Ross coming, it moved the populations. And there's not a concept of Puritans do not come to convert the native populations. They came for religious freedom for themselves. So for Europeans, you're not going to see this. The French, it's more manipulate the native populations. The English is to move the native populations. And the Spanish, however, and this is the amount of gold and silver. This is what we're going to talk about. One of the things that's coming. If you notice, look at this spike. And then here's around the time where Spain's going to die out. And how this all linked to, and this is the slave trade we talked about, that massive population shift that's going to happen. And remember, it was an African concept. Slavery is over there, but slavery in Africa was very different than what it is in the Caribbean. Slaves were allowed to own land in many cases. They weren't sold. It was based in an indentured servitude position, and that they had to replace the indentured servitude. And this is going to cause huge shifts in Europe. I mean, you're going to see the beginning of insurance because of this, insurance fraud because of this. And it becomes a problem even for Europeans eventually, that they can also, it becomes a problem when they get to the age of imperialism, in that they could actually produce things cheaper without slavery in areas like India. And then slavery became a burden to them. So that's slave ships. They'd rack and stack these boats to get as many people in. And this actually caused the migrational patterns of sharks to change. Because when you threw off unruly slaves or slaves that died, the sharks used to swim the other direction because it's easier to catch the fish when they're swimming towards you, and the fish would follow the currents, and the ships would go with the current, because the current would push the slave ships. Well, the sharks eventually started following the ships instead of going against the current, where it was easier to hunt, because they knew they'd get free meals. So, which is horrible, but it's true. Okay. And so you're to see that, and this is that competition thing. The French in the north, English along the coast here. Eventually you're going to see the French and English are going to move into the Caribbean here. And then these are the Spanish jailed areas. Okay. Now we'll talk about this later. At least when it came to the Spanish, that mulattoes, mestizos, who are born, one parent is either a slave in mulatto, or in the case of mestizos, that one parent is native. At least the natives are even on the chart. Okay. Women and slaves were on no charts in the north. All right. The rig part, actually, that's the part where you want to kind of talk about it, is that when we get later in the Haitian revolts, it starts out at the bottom, is the African slaves rise up against their owners in Haiti. And they're followed by groups of mulattoes and mestizos. But what really fires this up is the Creoles, that the Spanish basically ran their colonies with people from the peninsula. They're from Spain, which then meant that people that were born, free people that were Spanish born, that lived here, actually had less power in the colonies. And so that's what's going to lead and feed the revolts that you're going to see in many cases throughout the Caribbean when we get to the 1800s. And this is the part where the other question. Okay, so we've got the question about politics, economics, culture, right? This is how they treated native populations compared, and they would do this to compare to how we treated native populations in the 1800s in the age of imperialism. The biggest part of it focuses on this thing called the Income India. The Income India, when it comes to the Spanish, is that they saw themselves, and this is part of that whole Black Legend thing that's part of the reading, is that the Spanish saw themselves as helping the native populations. That if in exchange for labor, you then will aid me in digging the gold, right? And in exchange, I will give you my culture, my religion. I will civilize you, and therefore not hurt your family or you. That's the whole part in the reading, that you can't call a man dog unless his name is Dog, right? And so there's this adaptation. It's bad in the fact that you're destroying their culture. De la Casa is going to burn Mayan books and destroy their history. Okay? La Casa is going to introduce the idea of slavery, African slavery. He's one of them that proposes it because he wants to save the native population. The drive for La Casa to do this, Income India, right? The reason for it, and this is the influence, is that the trade-off is the horror. Yes, you destroy their culture, but the trade-off is that you created Latin American culture today. Hispanic culture is a direct tide. That you have the influence of Spanish architecture, the influence of Spanish language, the influence of Spanish religion, the influence of Spanish cultural concepts. That all these things mix in and create the modern Hispanic culture. So yes, you destroyed their culture from before, and you created this new one. But the trade-off is, and we'll come back to this one, and this is La Casa. The trade-off is that when you go look at what happens in the northern part, you even had native populations like the Cherokee in U.S. history that were extremely adapted to Western culture. They wore Western clothing. They lived in Westernized homes. They had their own language, their own alphabet. They even had their own constitution. And it still didn't stop you from moving them on. That in many cases, French, English forces actually either manipulated natives against each other or forcibly removed native populations. Unlike what we talked about in class, that if you want to see the influence of Spanish, Income India on the native populations, you just have to talk to anyone who's Hispanic. It's there. It's their language. It's their culture. It's who they are. Where's the native tie-in in ours? Well, you have to go to a reservation that we still separate out. The fact that you can go gamble at Ho Chunk because it's on a reservation shows the separating out of native populations out of Western population. So, and I know people are going to argue, well, look at our, no. We did that. They didn't. Okay. So, and by the way, what this is there basically was an argument over who gets what land. Well, this is a case where where Spain's money paid off, right? They basically pay the Pope to say that the line between Portuguese holdings and Spanish holdings are the line of papal demarcation. This is the Treaty of Tordesillas. Well, if you look at it, that means that the Portuguese get South America in the New World, and all of this is Spanish. So they basically swindled the Portuguese. And eventually they're just going to absorb Portugal here before long. But yeah, it was a payoff to the Pope, and then they drew the line, and it actually favored Spain. So, colonies, basically, Portugal is going to end up, they don't have enough people. They don't have the people to dominate and trade. That's why the Spanish are going to come in. You're going to see like I said, the Spain is going to take over Philippines. We're going to have English expeditionary forces in 1591. Eventually, we're going to see the Dutch show up and this English both in India. That we're going to talk about later. Okay. And you're going to see all these new colonial rivalries piking up, right? That's the pirate thing we're talking about. What's the impact? Obviously, native populations are just wiped out by this. Okay. Partly because culturally they're going to be wiped out with the Income India. Economically, they're going to be wiped out. In the case of North America, they're going to be removed from their lands. It's a whole thing, right? It's yeah. Yeah, we get it, right? Yeah. I don't know what else I can tell you about that. Um, if you're looking at the impact of the Columbian Exchange economically, besides that triangle trade, right, that led to a wealthy merchant class, another problem was what hit Spain. Not only does Spain get their butt kicked by Elizabeth in 1488 and wipes out their entire fleet, which ruined them economically. No fleet, no defend your empire. You spent billions of dollars on basically the 16th century version of an aircraft carrier, and these pirates sank them all. Well, here's the other economic thing for that question. The Spanish also kind of undid themselves, that they basically pilfered out any amount of gold and silver they could. And if you want an idea of how much silver is being pulled out of the New World, the very symbol of a dollar that we use today comes from the Spanish coins, the Spanish doubloon, silver coins. That's how much silver is coming out of the new world. At one point, Sir Francis Drake captures one ship. Him and his pirates capture one ship. That entire Spanish ship paid for the entire national treasure of England, the entire budget for the country of England for 1 year. That's how much silver and gold is coming out of the New World. The problem is unlike potatoes, tobacco, sugar, cotton, and trees, gold doesn't grow back. Gold and silver is a finite thing. Once you dig it up, it's gone. The fact that there are no major cash crops coming out of Spanish controlled areas will cripple the Spanish, because they're going to dump so much gold and silver into Europe that it causes the value of gold and silver to drop. And that causes inflation throughout Europe. The cost of goods goes up so much because the sheer amount of gold that's being dumped into the economy that it cripples, it hurts other countries and it hurts the growing merchant class. But it also is going to cripple Spain because they're relying on that gold and silver to buy all their nice new shiny ships and maintain their empire. And when that value drops, they can't maintain their empire. And once the gold and silver starts to run out, they can't maintain their empire. And once their fleet is wiped out, they cannot maintain their empire. Couple that with an overzealous religious leader named Philip II, who gets them literally in every possible religious conflict you can,